Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today we are going to be talking about the fourth quarter or the third act if you prefer 3-act structure. It's also sometimes called the climactic sequence. So we have finally reached the end of story structure. Today we will be wrapping up the main story structure series. I will be revisiting story structure down the road to talk about things like multiple points of view, creating series, things like that. So we will be revisiting structure in the future, but this is going to wrap up the main structural series for now. If you are worried about spoilers for examples, I will again be using films for the examples as I have throughout this series. So I will be spoiling completely Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, The Sixth Sense, Toy Story, Shrek, Oculus, The Woman in Black, Juno, Liar Liar, and 127 Hours. This quarter, the fourth quarter, in most cases, it's going to be the shortest quarter in your novel. For some novels, it might take up that full 25% and be a full quarter of the book. But in most cases, it's going to be closer to 20%, maybe even a little bit under 20%. It's not super common for it to take up that full 25%, but it could. So just keep in mind that you should do what makes sense for your specific story. In the previous video, we talked about the second plot point. So at the second plot point, the protagonist got the sort of last piece of information or a final realization that they needed to sort of kick them out of that dark night of the soul and into this active climactic sequence. So at this point, the protagonist knows roughly what they need to do. They have a pretty good gist of what's needed to succeed, although they might not have everything exactly right. They have a pretty good idea and pretty much the best idea they're going to have moving into the climax. So usually, but not always, the main emphasis is going to be on pursuing and confronting the antagonistic force. So that's the main element of the fourth quarter. However, the emphasis on the various elements depends a lot on the type of story, so we're going to get into that a lot. More drama type stories, internal antagonists, that type of thing is going to play out a lot different from your more classic villain or external antagonist type stories. So we will be getting into the details there, but just know that I'm going to go over the various sections in the fourth quarter, but they may play out with a lot more emphasis on one part or a different part depending on the type of story that you're writing and what makes sense for you. So the very first thing that happens in the fourth quarter is preparation. So the protagonist, they're ready to confront the antagonistic force. They want to start moving towards their goal. They want to solve their problem. Whatever the big picture main thing is that they're trying to do, they're getting ready to do that thing. But first they need to prepare. So this could be gathering up the people that they need, friends or assistants, any kind of person that might help them on their journey. It could be gathering up supplies. So maybe they need to get certain items or certain materials or maps or keys or things like that. They need to acquire certain materials in order to move forward. They might also just need to make a game plan or a plan of attack or discuss with the people involved how things are going to go. So for an example, in Toy Story, Buzz and Woody are of course trying to get back to Andy before the moving van. They want to move with him to the new house and not get left behind because they're trapped in Sid's house. At this point, during the preparation phase, Buzz has been taken by Sid. He has a rocket strapped to his back, and Buzz is planning on shooting him into space and exploding him. And so in this preparation phase, Woody gets the toys in Sid's room together, and they talk about the plan of attack. How are they going to escape? How are they going to get Buzz out? And how are they going to sort of teach Sid a lesson? So we see Woody sort of planning that. And that is this preparation phase. It's not very long, but in other films and books, it can be even shorter or really just implied or almost entirely skipped over. So, for example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the trio sort of discusses, or what are we going to do now that we know that Snape is trying to steal the Sorcerer's Stone? Dumbledore's out of the castle. He's not around. He can't stop him. What are we going to do? And Harry says, we're going to go down the trap door. That's really all the preparation we get. We can assume that they had additional conversation or they made additional plans Maybe they planned when they were going to meet, what time they were going to meet, or they planned getting the invisibility cloak or something like that. But we don't see that play out. It's really just we're going to go down the trapdoor, and that's really like the whole of the preparation phase. Another example is Shrek. So in Shrek, Shrek, of course, wants to stop Fiona from getting married to Farquaad. So Shrek and Donkey sort of gather the dragon. So the sort of gathering friends, they get the dragon to help them to fly to the wedding. And again, it's not really a scene. It's not even really a moment. It's sort of just skipped over, but there isn't really a big preparation phase other than saying, let's stop the wedding and gathering the dragon. So often it's just going to be a short sort of statement of what the intention is, not necessarily a full scene of genuine preparation. Sometimes, though, there will be a lot of time spent on this preparation phase, especially in situations where the protagonist needs to acquire a piece of information or maybe overcome a fear, or they may need to battle something internally in order to get what they need to kick off their journey. So, for example, in The Sixth Sense, Malcolm, Cole's therapist, the little boy's therapist, tells him, maybe you should try asking the ghosts what they need. Maybe they're just coming to you for help, and if you help them, maybe they'll leave you alone. So that's what happens at the second plot point. So in the preparation phase, Cole asks a ghost girl that's haunting him what she wants and what she needs, and we don't actually get much here in terms of what she actually says, but it's implied that she gives him this information. You might have heard previously that you should not introduce new information in the fourth quarter, and that's generally a good rule, but sometimes in this preparation phase there will be, and sometimes in other parts of the fourth quarter as well, potentially, there will be something that the protagonist hasn't acquired because of their own flaw or fear or false belief or something along those lines. So it's not that there's this sudden reveal of information that, there's no way Cole could have known. He could have asked the ghosts, any of the ghosts at any point, how he could help them, but it's not something that he knew to do, and it really wasn't something he was willing to do because he was afraid. So because he conquers his fear here to ask the ghost, how can I help you? What are you looking for? What do you need from me? Because that involves conquering a fear, it still feels like a fair win that he gets this information he needs. It doesn't feel like sort of cheating by throwing in new information in the fourth quarter. So you will sometimes see that in the preparation phase when it's longer. There will sometimes be sort of a need to overcome a fear or something along those lines in order to get the information. For example, maybe you have someone who was previously very prideful and they refuse to ask for help, and maybe they sort of swallow their pride and they ask someone, can you please give me the key to this door? I really need to go to this place and I can't get there without this key, can you please give it to me? And because it represents a swallowing of pride and growth for that character, it still feels earned. So sometimes there will be information gathered in the preparation phase that sort of gives you that sense that it was still a win for the character. The character still deserved to have that new information. It wasn't just thrown in willy-nilly or something along those lines. Hopefully that makes sense. What you don't want to do in the preparation phase is have a long, explicitly drawn out plan unless that plan doesn't go off according to how it was prepared for. So for example, if the characters say we're going to do X and then Y and then Z, and it plays out exactly like that and you don't subvert that, generally that's when you want to just skip over the preparation phase and say there was a plan, or sort of gloss it over, because it can be pretty boring or tedious for the reader if you set out a plan and then the characters execute the plan and it sort of just goes off according to how it was expected. So in most cases, the preparation is going to be short. It's going to be just gathering up the things, people, and the plan needed in order to move forward, but sometimes that will involve overcoming some sort of internal obstacle in order to get that information or get that person's help or something along those lines. So the next step after the preparation is the approach. So this is where the protagonist has what they need. They, maybe their friends, maybe allies of various types, are going to move towards the antagonist and towards that big confrontation, but they're probably going to meet some obstacles or some barriers along the way. This is going to vary a lot depending on the type of story. Again, some stories this is not going to be significant, other stories it's going to play a huge role. So a really good sort of classic example of this is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. The trio go through the trap door and they face a sequence of obstacles before they get to confronting Voldemort. This is also a really good demonstration of how you can use this section to give your side characters sort of a moment to shine. You might also show growth in the side characters based on how they react or what they do in this section. So we see that with Ron playing the wizard's chess. We see that with Hermione knowing how to conquer the devil's snare. It gives them a little moment to be the important one. And this can be really helpful, especially when those side characters do play a prominent role throughout the story. And you want to give them a little bit extra moment to shine in the end. You don't want to give all the glory to the protagonist. So this is a good moment to do that. And it's a good moment for side characters to have their arc or to face obstacles that are relevant to their particular fears and their particular problems aside from the protagonist. It's also very common, and again, we see this in Harry Potter, where the side characters are left behind during the approach. Sometimes they may be injured, they may even die. Sometimes there's just some obstacle that requires them to stay behind, and this forces the protagonist to face the antagonist alone, which is often integral to creating enough tension and anxiety around that confrontation. Again, it's not a requirement, but often it's just more effective for the protagonist to face the antagonist alone. And so this is a good section to come up with reasons why your side characters might get left behind and might not make it to that big confrontation. So, as I said, this section is sometimes very brief. In Shrek, for example, Shrek and Donkey fly on the dragon to the wedding. There's not really any obstacles that they face on the way. They just sort of fly straight there. There's a moment of confusion about how to time objecting to the wedding, but it's not this grueling series of obstacles like we see in Harry Potter. Sometimes the only significant obstacle during the approach is going to be emotional. Often this is going to be nervousness or fear. Very commonly in dramas, that's going to be the main source of tension for this section. So for example, Malcolm and Cole in The Sixth Sense, they go to the ghost girl's house. Her wake is happening. Her family is gathered there. And really the only thing of significance that occurs is Cole being nervous. So he's worried, he's anxious. You can kind of see that he's a little bit uncertain about the situation, but that's really it. There's no obvious external obstacle. So while the approach can often be relatively quick or more drama focused, it may also take up a tremendous amount of the fourth quarter. It may be where the bulk of the obstacles in the fourth quarter are situated. So for example, in Toy Story, the majority of the obstacles are in the approach. And when you think about the plot of Toy Story, this starts to make a lot of sense because the goal at this point, after they've escaped Sid's yard, the goal is to get to the moving van. So they've escaped, they want to get to the moving van. That's been their goal pretty much the entire time. They don't want Andy to move without them. So their goal is to get to a location. So once we get them to that location, their goal is pretty much achieved. So it makes sense that the vast majority of the obstacles are going to be in this approach phase. And so we see them get chased by a dog. We see Woody goes into the van and the toys kick him out because they think that he killed Buzz. We see the RC car that they're driving on run out of batteries. We just see obstacle after obstacle during this approach phase. Another example where the approach phase is the majority of the obstacles is in Liar Liar. And again, the goal is to get to a specific location. Fletcher, the main character, wants to get to the airport to stop his ex-wife from moving to Boston with his son because he wants them to stay living there and he doesn't want to lose them. So he faces a variety of obstacles on the way, trying to rush to the airport. So after this approach, whether it's short or long, we will get to the confrontation. So this section will look tremendously different depending on the type of story that you're writing. If your story has an antagonist or a villain, a person that is actively attempting to go against the protagonist in some way, they will have a face-to-face confrontation here in this section. that confrontation should in some way be more extreme or more dramatic or more intense than their previous confrontations. This is usually achieved by having it be either the first time they've ever had a confrontation, the first time there's been a confrontation since the protagonist has known the identity of the antagonist. It may be the first time the protagonist has faced the antagonist just entirely by themselves or alone. There are many different ways that you can make this confrontation different from previous confrontations, but there needs to be an element of increased intensity. If the protagonist has already faced off against the antagonist in one earlier in the book, and those circumstances aren't different here, we're not really going to get why this is a big deal or why this moment is the biggest moment. So to make this confrontation this biggest moment of the story, it's important that there be some sort of novel element to how this confrontation goes. So, for example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, there are a few different novel elements to this confrontation. This is the first time Harry realizes that it's not Snape after the stone, that is Professor Quirrell. So this is the first time he's ever confronted Quirrell. Previously, when he didn't really confront Voldemort, but when he saw Voldemort in the woods eating the unicorn, drinking the unicorn blood, Firenze, the centaur, came and saved him from that. So he didn't really confront him by himself. He had help in that situation. This situation, he knows his plan. He knows he's after the stone. He's confronting him directly. He's all alone. All his friends are left behind. So there's a tremendous increase in intensity in this confrontation versus any other interactions, which really was only one interaction with Voldemort, which was when he was drinking the unicorn blood. So some type of increase in stakes is going to be extremely helpful in this section to create a big sense of intensity, that aloneness, that knowing what the plan is, knowing who the identity is. We need something that makes it more serious than previous interactions. Many stories, however, will not have a villain. So in that case, this confrontation is a little bit trickier because we're not going to have that face-to-face confrontation with the villain because there isn't one. In that case, what we typically see is that the antagonist of the story is usually something within the character themselves. Even if their main obstacle is fighting with another character, that's usually going to be built on something wrong with them, a flaw that they have, some issue that they need to work towards overcoming. So in this confrontation, this big moment, it's not going to look quite as scary, intense, confrontation-y as it's going to look if there's a villain. So, for example, in Liar Liar, the confrontation is Fletcher, just basically arriving at the airport in this big dramatic fashion and apologizing to his son and saying, I've changed. I don't want to be a liar anymore. I want to be here for my family. And that's really what the confrontation is. So to replace that big fight or that intense action sequence that we would see if there was a villain, to replace that, we usually will replace that with a big reconciliatory gesture. So the protagonist will do something to make amends and to reconcile. And this will be some sort of big display. Usually there'll be some kind of risk involved, even if the risk is just putting themselves out there. There'll be some level of risk or intensity to this gesture. And then that's usually followed up by a heart-to-heart, a meaningful conversation where the protagonist explains how they've grown and how they've changed. In some stories, we'll see a mix of both righting a wrong and a face-to-face confrontation. For example, in Shrek objects to the wedding. He sort of confesses his feelings to Fiona in this sort of big gesture. There's some risk for him because he's in a situation where he's going to most likely be arrested by Farquaad. So there's some risk involved. He does also have a confrontation with Farquaad, who tries to stop him. So we do see a mix of that righting a wrong, reconciliatory gesture, and a confrontation with an antagonist. If the story has an antagonist, that antagonist does need to be involved in the confrontation. It's somewhat common in amateur writing to see an attempt to write a confrontation where the antagonist and the protagonist do not have a showdown or don't have a face-to-face confrontation. This is almost never going to work. It's going to be really difficult to create a nice rounded feel to the story. It's going to feel like you sort of just chopped it off and ended it early. I will talk about this more in future videos because I do want to make a video on writing a series. But I would recommend in 99% of cases, if there's an antagonist, there needs to be a showdown with that antagonist during the confrontation. It's a vital part of the ending, and it's really important to give the reader that satisfaction. If you do want to leave it open-ended, so you want it to be clear that the antagonist isn't permanently defeated, you can definitely leave that open-ended, but there should still be a confrontation. So, for example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry has a confrontation with Voldemort. Voldemort is defeated for the time being, but when Harry talks to Dumbledore, he says, does this mean Voldemort can't return? And Dumbledore says there are ways that he can come back. So we see very clearly that this isn't a situation where he's permanently defeated him. And that's really going to be your best bet for leaving it open-ended rather than not including a showdown with the antagonist at all. So while we have a reconciliatory gesture that can happen at the same time as a confrontation with the antagonist, we do sometimes have stories where a single confrontation isn't sufficient. Those two things cannot be addressed in the same scene. There may be multiple confrontations. This can happen for a variety of reasons. It could be because there are multiple protagonists, multiple antagonists, multiple issues, sometimes internal and external issues that are not as closely linked as perhaps in other stories, so they require two different moments of confrontation. So a good example of this would be The Sixth Sense. We might actually consider that to have 3 confrontations. So like we talked about previous, Cole goes to the family's house. He confronts his fear of the ghosts. He helps the ghost. That sort of solves his external problem of being afraid of these ghosts and having to deal with that. But that's not really Cole's only problem or even necessarily his main problem, because we see that his relationship with his mom is also a significant issue in the story, and that he's very concerned that she may think that he's a freak, that she might not like him if she knew that he saw dead people. So we do see another confrontation where through conquering his fear of the ghosts, he's then able to tell his mom, he sort of gains some strength and growth, and he's able to tell her that he sees ghosts, and they're able to sort of reconcile their relationship. Likewise, Malcolm, his external issue was really wanting, but it was really an internal issue as well. He sort of has 2 internal issues, but his more externally focused issue was wanting to help Cole to sort of make peace regarding this similar client he had, Victor, who he did not help, and he wasn't able to help that boy. And so he sort of wanted to help Cole as sort of a way to make up for that previous failing. So he does that by helping Cole with the ghost. However, that's not his only issue. Malcolm's other issue is that he's sort of distant and estranged from his wife. And so confronting that issue is also important. And so we need to see that happen as well. And again, conquering that sort of external issue sort of gave him the strength and ability to conquer his internal issue and confront his wife and tell her how he really feels and sort of apologize. And so we get these sort of 2-pronged confrontation with both the more externally focused obstacle as well as then a more internally focused reconciliatory gesture. But in this case, they're all separate from each other, so we end up with 3 different confrontation moments. Another example of a 2-part confrontation is in Juno. So Juno has 2 different issues. She's finding it difficult to express her feelings about Bleecker, her love interest, and so she has a confrontation where she tells him how she really feels about him. But then that doesn't address the more externally focused issue of her pregnancy. So we then, of course, also have a confrontation where she gives birth and she gives her child to Vanessa, the adoptive parent. So that sort of solves that more external issue, but those 2 things don't happen at the same time. So once that happens, that confrontation occurs, at some point during or after the confrontation, there will be a surprise. So this is sometimes called a twist. The reason that I wouldn't call it a twist is because a twist can occur anytime in a book or in a film. The twist doesn't inherently mean in the 4th quarter. A lot of stories have a midpoint twist, so it doesn't really depend on the time. The other reason is that most of the time this is going to seem more like a surprise than a twist. It's not really going to, in most cases, it's not totally changing our interpretation of the story, which is what a traditional twist would do, is it would give information that changes how you would interpret the events of the story. in most cases, that's not going to happen in the fourth quarter. Something's going to happen that's just a surprise, and that surprise could come from anywhere as long as it feels rooted in the story. So you set it up in some way. So let's start by looking at a more traditional twist. So in The Sixth Sense, Malcolm realizes that he's been dead the entire time. That's the surprise in the fourth quarter, and that follows your more traditional concept of a twist where it sort of subverts our expectations and changes the meaning of the entire story, or it changes our interpretation of the events of the story. But normally the point of this surprise is not so much to subvert everything that's come before or to change our interpretation. It's just to make things a little bit trickier. The protagonist has prepared for this confrontation. They've approached the antagonist or the antagonistic force. They've done the confrontation. We just want things to not go quite so easy and tidy. We don't want things to go exactly according to plan. So this is just a way to make things a little bit trickier, and so that surprise can come from anywhere, and it doesn't have to be a twist necessarily. So, for example, in Shrek, when Shrek confesses his love to Fiona, Fiona believes, and the audience believes that Fiona will be in her human form forever. She'll be beautiful as a human, but that's not what happens. When she confesses her love, she actually stays permanently in her ogre form. So that's a big surprise for the reader. It's a big surprise, or for the viewer rather, and it's a big surprise for Fiona because it's not what she expected either. But this highlights an important element of the surprise, which is that it has to be a surprise to the viewer or to the reader. It can't only be a surprise to the characters. So this is a really good demonstration. Shrek is a really good demonstration because they could have had the surprise be that Shrek realizes that Fiona turns into an ogre at night, because that's not something that Shrek knew. But because that was something that we as the viewer already knew, Shrek finding that out wouldn't have counted as a surprise because it wouldn't be a surprise to us as the viewers. So they then have to take that an extra step further and add another element of surprise, which is that she stays in her ogre form. It wouldn't have been enough just for Shrek to find out, because it wouldn't have been a surprise to the viewer as well. So sometimes this surprise is that the entire premise of the confrontation is not correct. So for example, in The Woman in Black, Arthur he reunites the corpse son of the woman in black, of the ghost. So her son passed away. He finds the body and reunites the ghost with the body of her son. And he leaves that confrontation believing that he succeeded, that was what he was supposed to do. But the surprise is that the woman in black, the ghost, she's not at peace at all, and she shows up to lure Arthur's son off of a train platform to his death. So the surprise is actually that he was completely wrong in thinking that he succeeded, and he just didn't succeed at all. Sometimes the surprise will be an unexpected solution, and a good example of this sort of unexpected solution is in Toy Story. So Woody and Buzz, they get stranded. The RC car that they're driving on, trying to chase after the moving van, it runs out of batteries, so they're stranded. They don't have a way to get to Andy, and they sort of think this is it. This is the end. You know, there's not really any way to succeed now. But they end up lighting the rocket. And Buzz deploys his wings and sort of flies them to the moving van. So we didn't think that he'd be able to fly. And though he still isn't flying, he does use his wings to solve the problem, which is that sort of surprise element. If you're having a hard time understanding why that qualifies as a surprise, or why any moment qualifies as the surprise, or if you're trying to figure out what surprise would make sense for your specific story, look for something that resolves a misunderstanding or a failure that occurred around the midpoint, because almost always this surprise is going to reference something that happened around the midpoint. For example, in Toy Story, around the midpoint was when Buzz attempted to fly. He sees a TV commercial, realizes he's a toy, he attempts to fly, he falls and he breaks. And then here at the surprise, he is able to fly them to safety. So it references back to that event. In Shrek, Fiona at the midpoint is disappointed to see that she was rescued by an ogre because she feels like a princess and an ogre, they don't go together. And then here in the surprise, we see that Fiona is actually an ogre herself now permanently. So we see that reference back to that midpoint failure or mistake or misunderstanding. In The Sixth Sense, it is at the midpoint that Cole tells Malcolm, I see dead people, they don't know that they're dead. Malcolm doesn't know that he's dead. He realizes as a surprise that he's been dead the whole time. In The Woman in Black, Arthur actually reads a letter at the midpoint in which the Woman in Black ghost says, I'll never forgive what happened to my son. I'm never going to get over this. And the surprise is that she, in fact, doesn't ever get over it. And so when Arthur attempted to give her peace with her son, with the corpse of her son, it failed. So the surprise is that it failed, but it references back to this letter where that information was already given. So you can use that as a sort of trick if you're struggling to figure out what the surprise is in a book or a film, or if you're struggling with your own story or trying to figure out what would make a good surprise. You can also use this in reverse. If you know what the surprise is going to be, you can use it to add depth to the midpoint and reference it then and sort of build backwards in that way. So after the surprise, next comes the sacrifice. So the sacrifice is the moment where we really see how the character has grown. So the sacrifice will be required for them to succeed, but it may or may not be a literal sacrifice. A good example of a more literal sacrifice is in The Sixth Sense. So Malcolm realizes sort of that he's dead, but he also realizes that his presence is sort of holding his wife back from moving forward. So he has to let go of his wife and move on to the afterlife. Another good example of that is in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And here we see another really common element of the sacrifice, which is temptation. So often the antagonist will sort of try to tempt the protagonist to not make the sacrifice. So they'll sort of tempt them with something that they really want, and they'll have to sacrifice that thing. So for example, in Harry Potter, Voldemort tells Harry if he joins him, they can bring back his parents. He'll be able to be reunited with his parents, which we know is something that Harry really wants. And then Harry has to make that choice to sacrifice his parents, reuniting with his parents for the greater good. So he refuses that because he knows that Voldemort coming to power would be a very bad thing. So you often have this temptation element, sometimes intentional, like the antagonist purposefully trying, and sometimes the temptation is just because it's something that the protagonist really wants, even if there's not someone there purposefully trying to tempt them with it. And then you do typically see that the reason that the sacrifice is made is because it's for the greater good. So they're able to let go of something that they want to benefit other people, their friends, their family, society as a whole. There's some reason that letting this go is going to be beneficial for others. So it's often a very selfless sacrifice. This should tie back to all the work you've done throughout the story to create the internal conflict. So, for example, in The Sixth Sense, it's referenced frequently that Malcolm wants to make peace regarding this previous client, Victor, who he feels like he failed, and because he was able to make peace by helping Cole to solve his problem with the ghosts, that allowed him to be able to have that growth and sort of move on. In Harry Potter, Harry sort of finds a home in Hogwarts, which helps him to be able to let go of that need to be with his family. So it's definitely something that you need to have built throughout the whole story so that it has the right impact. If you simply just take something and say, something that was never a relevant internal conflict throughout the story, but you just hold that thing hostage and just say, I won't give you this thing unless you sacrifice something. It's not going to have the same impact if you haven't built it through the whole story. So this should be built from the internal conflict that you have been working on throughout the story. So it should be fairly obvious what this sacrifice should be. Sometimes the sacrifice is not going to be literal really in any sense. It's going to be the sacrifice of a perspective, an opinion, a belief. They're going to be letting go of something that was previously important to them, but internally. It's just a thought that was really important or a feeling that was really important, a belief, something along those lines. For example, back to Toy Story again, in that moment when Buzz flies them to the van and into Andy's car, first Woody says, you're flying, very happy, triumphant, and we see that as major growth for Woody, who's been very jealous and sort of stingy with Andy's attention, wants to be the best one, doesn't want Buzz to think he's like all that. He wants to sort of bring Buzz down a peg. So his ability to just sort of triumphantly say like you're flying, like with a very positive, genuine attitude, is letting go of that issue that he has with Buzz. And Buzz in turn says, I'm not flying, I'm falling with style, which is referencing back to something that Woody said to Buzz in a mean way, but Buzz is sort of accepting that as his identity. So Buzz is sort of grown here, and we see that because Buzz is saying, I can't fly. I know I'm not, even now I'm not deluding myself. I don't think that I'm really flying. And that's major growth for Buzz. So in that moment, we see major growth for both characters, and it's a sacrifice of perspective or viewpoint. It's not really a literal sacrifice of anything. It is often just going to be something, a moment that demonstrates that the protagonist has definitely let go of their flaw, their false belief, or an unhealthy longing or an unhealthy desire in some way. So, the final section of the entire story is the aftermath. The aftermath is a final moment that demonstrates where the protagonist is now, where sort of the effects of the story, how it has impacted their life, what's changed, where they're at now that all the events of the story are over. A really clean and simple example of that is in Juno. So at the end of Juno, we see her playing guitar with Bleecker, her love interest, and they're a couple. She kisses him on the cheek, and it's just a very simple, things are back to normal. Plus now she has a boyfriend with Bleecker. Things are happy. We also see Vanessa with her baby, which is what she wanted. So we see her happy having the thing that she wants. So it's just a quick little moment. In most cases, we will see that though the protagonist didn't get the thing that they originally wanted, they're better and happier for it. So, for example, in Toy Story, at the end, we see Woody dancing with his friends at Christmas away from the walkie-talkie. So in the beginning opening scene of the film, we saw him really hanging on the walkie-talkie, wanting to know what new toys were coming in for Andy's birthday. Now it's Christmas, new toys are coming in, but because he's grown, we see him dancing, having fun, not obsessing about the walkie-talkie. So though he didn't get the thing he wanted to be the best toy, the favorite toy, what he got is something more meaningful, deeper, and he's ultimately better for it. In Shrek, we see a sort of similar type ending where he's sort of partying with his friends in the swamp. The swamp was something he previously defended as his own personal sanctuary. He didn't want anyone to be there, but we see that he's grown here and he's happier, even though he doesn't have the thing he originally wanted, which was privacy. He has friends and he sort of feels more accepted, and so he is happier. Sometimes the aftermath is worse. So sometimes the character will be worse off than before. For example, in Oculus, Tim, the brother character, was taken away by the police screaming that, it was the mirror, it wasn't him that killed his sister, it was the mirror. And we can kind of assume that he's going to be institutionalized. He was institutionalized at the beginning of the film because of an interaction with the mirror in his childhood. We can assume here again, he's kind of going to go back to the institution. Things didn't really get better for him. This wasn't a positive ending for him. This is not uncommon in horror. It's sort of part of horror. Often is sort of insurmountable odds. You don't typically get the idea that they're likely to succeed. It's very common in horror for everybody to fail. So it doesn't stand out as particularly odd. In most stories, even most horror though, you will typically have more of a bittersweet ending rather than a full loss or a full negative aftermath. For example, in The Sixth Sense, Malcolm tells his wife that she was never second, but he does still leave her to cross over into the afterlife. So you feel like he's grown, he made peace with his wife, that's a nice moment. He still has to leave, which is sad, so there's a bittersweet element to that, and that's a little bit more common. We also see that in The Woman in Black. Arthur jumps off the train platform to save his son. It ends up that they both are killed, and he and his son are reunited with his wife, who passed away during childbirth. So even though they're all dead, they're also all reunited, which is sort of a positive thing. So you do typically see more of a bittersweet ending rather than a full negative ending, but probably the most likely ending is the full positive, or the mostly full positive, because there will be something the protagonist wanted that they didn't get, but typically we will see that as a good thing, as if they're better off for it. It is a good idea to foreshadow if the protagonist is going to have a less than positive aftermath. Typically, this is going to be foreshadowed throughout the story. For example, we see that in The Sixth Sense, we see Cole tell Malcolm that the dead people don't know they're dead. We actually see Malcolm die in the opening scene. We don't realize, but it does look like he more or less died in the opening scene. We just assume that he got better, but we didn't actually see it. So it's not that we were misled in a way that felt unfair. So it is important to make sure if the aftermath is going to be negative that there's some implication. We see that in Oculus as well. We get the impression there's no way anyone's really going to win against this mirror. When Kaylee, the sister character, tells Tim, the brother character, about the mirror, she tells him all these people who died and basically says, no one's ever beat this mirror before. So we don't really have high expectations that either of them are going to be able to defeat the mirror. And the woman in black, again, at the midpoint, we saw Arthur read a letter where the woman said she's never going to forgive what happened to her son. So we don't really expect that he's going to necessarily solve it. Maybe we kind of hope that he will, but it's not totally out of the blue in these cases when the aftermath is less than positive. Sometimes the full aftermath is more implied. So the protagonist might simply emerge from a bad situation and sort of look at the sunrise, and that might just be the end. It might just be that feeling of escape from a negative situation. It's common for the aftermath to be sort of skimmed over, skipped over, etc. in a situation where it would be structurally weird to play it out. So for example, it would take many steps. Say you're stranded somewhere. A good example of this would be 127 hours. So in that, Aaron escapes from having his arm crushed under the boulder. He leaves. It would be very lengthy and odd with the pacing if we then play that out and he gets airlifted, he goes to the hospital, he recovers at the hospital, he reunites with his family, he becomes famous for his story. We see instead just a sort of quick montage in film. You can do that in novel writing. We don't have the same benefits of the quick montage. So most likely in that type of case, you would not necessarily, but often you might just skip over that sequence and sort of just imply how it's going to play out, because it would be structurally very odd to not do so. In most cases, the aftermath is going to be short, but occasionally you will need a longer aftermath. For example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, there are some extra loose ends and things that need to be tied up. So after the confrontation, there's a longer aftermath period. So Harry talks to Dumbledore. They sort of tie up some loose ends. We also see the House Cup awarded, which it's important because the House Cup was referenced throughout the story, so we couldn't just skip over that. We sort of felt like, we needed to see how that played out, so it's sort of important to include. And then we see Harry board the train, which is more of your classic aftermath moment where we see how he has grown. So Hermione says, it feels strange to be going home. And Harry says, I'm not going home, not really, which shows that he doesn't really view the Dursleys as his home anymore. He views Hogwarts as his home. So that's sort of how he's grown, connecting to him letting go of the longing to reunite with his parents. So sometimes you will need a few extra scenes, but make sure that you genuinely need them. You don't want to linger unnecessarily long. This can have some negative consequences. It could seem excessively sugary sweet. So if you play everything out and you're sort of going through, their life ended up so great and everything went exactly, they got married and had babies and it was this beautiful, ending, you can draw it out too long and it can be a little bit too sweet, a little cloying. You can also close the door too firmly on the character. So sometimes readers or viewers, they sort of like to imagine the future of that character, sort of imagine other things they get up to. And if you play things out too far and you really close the door on their whole life, sometimes you can kind of take away that experience of, imagining what they get up to after the course of the story. So that might be another reason not to extend the aftermath excessively long. So those are the steps of the fourth quarter. So you have the preparation, the approach, the confrontation, the surprise, the sacrifice, and the aftermath. But before we wrap up the fourth quarter, there's another important element that I want to go over, and that is the importance of creating meaningful obstacles and meaningful solutions to those obstacles. So depending on your particular story, the bulk of your obstacles might be in the preparation phase, the approach phase, or the confrontation phase, maybe evenly across all of them. But no matter where those obstacles occur, It's important that they feel meaningful. A very common problem in amateur writing is that these fourth quarter obstacles will feel like a random sequence of events that don't really have anything to do with anything, with random solutions that couldn't have been predicted in advance, and it just doesn't feel well integrated into the rest of the story. A great fourth quarter is going to use obstacles and solutions that pull together loose threads, mysteries, characters that were previously met, skills that were previously acquired. It's going to build on the rest of the story. So the whole story up to this point should be supporting this fourth quarter. We shouldn't be getting totally random events and random solutions. Now, when I say that, I'm not trying to say that there can't be unexpected obstacles or unexpected solutions, but rather that the element of the solution and the obstacle should in some way have been built on things that already existed in the story. For example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry didn't know what obstacles were going to be in the dungeon. We didn't know what obstacles were going to be in the dungeon, but we knew that there were going to be obstacles in the dungeon, so it's not a surprise that was already mentioned. And the solutions were acquired earlier in this story. So Harry didn't know that he was going to have to ride a broom to catch the specific key to open the door, for example. But he already knew how to fly. We saw him learn how to fly. We saw him be very good at flying. So when flying is the solution, it's not as if he picks up a broom for the first time in the fourth quarter and he's suddenly, he's able to complete this task. It's just easy for no reason in terms of we didn't see it built on anything previous in the story. If you do that, the reader will feel cheated. It'll feel just too easy. It'll feel like a cop-out, like just an excessively simple solution. If he just picked up a broom and he could fly perfectly and he could catch this key, it had not been built from what already occurred in the story. The protagonist might not even be aware that they have acquired a skill. So, for example, in Toy Story, when Buzz and Woody are stranded with the RC car, they have the rocket. Woody lights the rocket by using Buzz's helmet as a magnifying glass, so he lights the rocket with the sun, which references back to when Sid used a magnifying glass to burn Woody's forehead. This was not something Woody actively tried to learn. It was just some information that he acquired over the course of the story. So these can reference back to things that weren't purposeful lessons or skills that were intentionally acquired. And Toy Story is a great example of referencing back to previous events and information given throughout the story, because there are many, many, many payoffs in the fourth quarter. So, for example, Woody uses Sid's scary toys to scare Sid. The dog escapes through the door, and that helps them to escape from the house. So they follow the dog, or rather, they use the dog as a diversion and then leave out of Sid's house. Later, the dog also chases them when they're on the RC car. They use the RC car, which was a character introduced earlier in the story. They use the rocket that Sid strapped to Buzz's back to send him into space. We have the reference back to, of course, Buzz's wings and being able to fly-ish with them. So there's a ton of payoff. There's tons and tons of references back to things that already occurred. You could also have the protagonist use solutions that they previously wouldn't use due to their flaw. So, for example, perhaps the protagonist was afraid of heights, so previously they never would have been able to cross a bridge, but they're able to, because they overcame their fear, they're able to cross that bridge now because they've grown and they're able to overcome this fear. So that's another thing you can reference back to, just so that these obstacles feel rooted in something and the solutions feel rooted in something. Totally random events do not play out that well. You might also have characters who were previously helped come back into the story to help the protagonist. For example, Donkey was sort of nice to the dragon when they were saving Fiona, and that dragon character comes back in because the dragon loves Donkey and helps them with the end, and actually eats Farquaad in the end, so helps them defeat the antagonist. So that's a payoff for something that already occurred. It's if the dragon had just shown up and eaten Farquaad and we hadn't based that on the fact that the dragon loved Donkey, it would feel very odd and very random. So try to make sure to integrate the fourth quarter into the rest of the novel. It should be very referential to things already occurring, even if we don't know flying keys exist before we see them in the dungeon. We know flying exists, and we know the obstacles will exist. We aren't completely blindsided by these just completely random events. And of course, the solution will always be something that the protagonist already knows how to do. They will not acquire a new skill in the fourth quarter. They will not acquire information required to succeed in the fourth quarter. That will all be things that they acquired and learned earlier in the novel. So that is it. That is story structure in a nutshell. It's really an endless topic. We could talk about it forever and ever. And of course, there's exceptions. There's ways to sort of fudge it a little bit so it sort of hits the gist of plot points, but not exactly in the way necessarily that I've outlined. I have been as broad as I can with this series while also being as specific as I think will be helpful. But there's a lot more that we could talk about, so I will make more videos in the future. But for now, I think I'm going to move on to some other topics for a little while. If you do have some topics, suggestions, or ideas, or things you're really itching to know about, let me know in the comments. If you want to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. I have a story structure beat sheet with sort of the breakdown of everything we've talked about, a little bit perhaps better organized even than in these videos, and as well as a worksheet that you can use to plot your novel or edit your novel. Both of those are available at the $5 and up tier if you want to help support the channel. I will be back with a new video. I am working on several different ones right now, so I'm not sure which will get out first, but I will be back hopefully within a few weeks. And in the meantime, happy writing, guys.